Angular is represented by the letter A, that means stack. It's an open source JavaScript framework created by Google back in 2010 for single page application development, mainly for the front end. The first version was called AngularJS, and it was written in JavaScript. Version 2 came out in about 2016, and they dropped the JS from the name for two reasons. One is because it's written in TypeScript. Two is because they completely rewrote the rendering engine. So it's a different model from the first version. So nowadays, when you hear the term Angular, it's always referred to this newer model. And if you're not too familiar with TypeScript, yeah, don't worry too much about it because the code, the syntax is just really so similar to JavaScript. It's actually a superset of JavaScript, so you should be fine. The version that we'll be using for this course is Angular 9, which is also the latest stable version at the time of this recording. And they release a new version, or major version is released every 6 months. So that's pretty interesting. Well, let's take a look at the Angular architecture. So an Angular is composed of an application. The Angular application has a root module and then has a root component. These are very important to understand. We'll see that later in the code. But as your application grows and you have more components, you can have child components, and those child components can have their own child components. So you have this hierarchical structure. Looks very similar to the DOM tree to me, right? But as you add more and more components, usually you want to combine them together, and you have something called a child module. So you can have other modules as well. And it wouldn't be complete though, because Angular needs a way to communicate with the outside world, meaning with other servers. So you can have this thing called HTTP client, which is a really important module that Angular uses to communicate with the server through AJAX. And then it has a built-in routing system, so you can use the router to configure your own routes, and the router will also detect routes in the URL. So pretty handy and pretty cool. But I think one of the most important features in Angular is this services, or service, and this DI system here. These are important because with the service, you can inject this information, or in this case, like a data source or data center somewhere in the application, to each component where they need it. So you can inject data to the child component, to a module, or even to another Angular application on the same server. So that's pretty interesting. So let's take a look at an example of what an application might look like. Angular is a component-based framework. So each of these little things you see here is a component, and you can envision what it might look like. So in the top bar, that blue bar up there could be a header component. And within the header component, you can see I can break that left component into like a logo component. On the right side could be a navigation component, and so on, right? And then we have the orange box there, could be the body component or the content, and we have a footer component at the bottom. Of course, the footer is really simple, but you see that some footer can have like 3 or 4 or 5 different columns and have their own individual component as well. So that is pretty much the logic here. Now, each of these components you see here is considered a view. It's called an Angular view. And so let's take a look at what the Angular view model looks like. So here we have a module, either a child module or the root module that has the component, right? We saw the diagram earlier. So the component has two things, a component and a template. So the template is considered as the view where you see the things in the browser, and then the component is the source, or we call the business logic. So if you think about the MVC paradigm, you should understand this really well, right? So the view and the model and the source, right? So the model is not shown here, but the model can be coded within the component or in a separate module. You just basically input them in. But how do these two pieces, the template and component, talk to each other? Is through a metadata. Okay, so the metadata, you can have it so that you can let the template and the component talk to each other. Otherwise, how do you know which template to talk to or which component to send data to? Okay, so when they're talking to each other, I'm referring to data binding. So you can bind data from the source out to the view through the property binding, or from the view back to the source through event binding, something you should be familiar with JavaScript. And so if you have a data source or another component in the template that does both of these together, like simultaneously, that you have what's called a two-way data binding, and we'll learn that later in the course. Some of the really interesting feature in Angular. So, but it's not all, right? Remember we talked about injection systems, and so there's an injector that can inject services to a component, and then those components can consume those services, things like data source or other functions, and so on. And then on the template side, you also have something called directives. These are mainly called Angular directives, and there are two types called attribute and structural and directives. Things like ngIf, ng-for, model, and class, and many others as well. These are just, special directives that allows you to perform some really simple expressions or decision making in the template view side, because you cannot do those in the source code. I mean, you cannot write source code in the template. So that is pretty much what the Angular view model looks like. And you'll see that this is a little maybe complex, but when you write the code itself, you see it's not as difficult as you may seem here.